Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today's presentation on glyphosate and communicating risk. I just want to do a little housekeeping to begin with. I want you to know that through the presentation, you all will be on mute, and we're asking you to save questions to the end, but I'll be monitoring questions and the chat box. And if something comes up that needs to be addressed, I will let Kaci know, and she can address it at that time. But preferably, we'll wait to the end because she has a great deal to cover. Also, let's see. So this will take a full hour and a half with the question and answer period at the end. So again, you'll have to just type your question into the question box or the chat box, and I'm monitoring both. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today. She's Kaci Buhl. She's an associate professor of practice at Oregon State University. She coordinates the statewide pesticide safety education program, training professional pesticide applicators in Oregon. On the national level, Ms. Buhl is the Deputy Director of the Pesticide Education Resource Collaborative, which creates pesticide manuals, exams, and other resources for professionals. So this is an introduction to a really great resource for all of us. She earned her MS in IPM at Michigan State University and previously coordinated the National Pesticide Information Center. So with that, I am going to hand over the reins to Kaci. Kaci, welcome.
Thank you very much, Terry, and thank you for the invitation. And thank you all for attending. I hope to make very good use of your time. We have quite a bit of information to cover in the 60 minutes, and then we're being very careful to save time for questions and answers at the end. So let's just jump right into it. You should be seeing my it's not advancing to the next slide. There we go. Are you seeing a slide that has the NPIC logo now? Okay, good. All right, so NPIC, the National Pesticide Information Center, I formerly coordinated that project. I worked there for 10 years, and I used to serve as a specialist on the phones as well. I've answered over 10,000 inquiries myself. So that's where my street cred comes from when it comes to communicating with the public about pesticides. That's a lot. And lots of conversations with individuals who were concerned on a variety of levels. So while my background's in integrated pest management, and I'm excited to have so many IPM coordinators on the phone today at the webinar, risk communication has become an area of focus in my work. I hope you'll visit the website later on. I'm going to give you the website address at the end and make use of the National Pesticide Information Center. In today's webinar, I'll spend just a couple of slides talking about what the center is. I hope to earn your trust so that you can give out the phone number for the Pesticide Information Center for folks who might be concerned about pesticides that are being applied here and there. You can also put our website address and our phone number on your pieces of public outreach literature. You're welcome to do that, and it's a communication move that builds trust. We're going to talk about those later on in the talk today. So NPIC, we're going to tackle some of the problems with glyphosate in particular, and then we'll go into the science of risk perception and a framework for risk communication that we've built here at NPIC over time. We'll cover some communication moves that build trust, and then I'll move into the Q&A. So let's dive right in. The National Pesticide Information Center was created over 20 years ago as an objective information service for pesticides. We're open with phone service 4 hours a day, Monday through Friday. And if that sounds weird, it kind of is. It used to be 8 hours a day, Monday through Friday, but we took a 50% budget cut. So that's 50% the phone hours and 50% the staff. And I'm sure that rings familiar for some of you folks. But we're hoping to get back up to 8 hours a day and weekend service in the future. We're funded almost entirely by EPA, 95% funding from EPA on a cooperative agreement that we continue to earn every 3 to 5 years. It's open for competition. Just to underline the national part of National Pesticide Information Center, I wanted to show you that we do receive inquiries from all around the nation, and they typically reflect the population in those states, California, Texas, and New York being the top 3 states. where we receive inquiries from. We'd love to see more inquiries from the Great Plains states in particular. What are some reasons that you might call the National Pesticide Information Center? Well, we can compare the toxicity of products, evaluate their persistence, discuss specific pesticides and their potential health effects. We can talk about risk to groundwater, fish, bees, pets. We can help with confusing label statements and help you find local resources. It's a huge breadth, but we don't make pesticide recommendations. We can't tell someone what to use in a certain state, nor would we, and we also have to draw the line at diagnosing problems. Very often people call and say, I have this symptom and I was exposed to this pesticide. Do you think that's the cause? Well, we're not healthcare providers, but we can look into the literature and see what's been reported for other cases of exposure to the same product. So think of us like a pesticide library. I should mention that we can provide service in over 170 languages. Most of the time, that means our 2 Spanish speakers that are on staff field a lot of questions in Spanish, but we can bring interpreters on the phone through a contract we have with Language Line Services. Interpreters are on the phone within 30 seconds. And I just put up a quick picture of some of our Spanish comics that we've been building in the last couple of years. We'll take a frequently asked question and turn it into something that hopefully gets shared a lot on social media. Where do people find out about us? About a third of our callers find out about us on product labels. About another third from the internet. Several pest control companies put our phone number on their invoices, and we appreciate that. But otherwise, there's lots of organizations and professionals who refer people to NPIC, and we hope that you will too at the end of this presentation. What are some example questions that we receive? Is it safe to use a certain pesticide in my kitchen if I have kids? If I use Roundup to clear some land, is it going to hurt plants that are 20 feet away? If I put BTI briquettes, those are for mosquitoes, in the fish, will that hurt the fish in my koi pond? No. How long do I have to wait before harvesting treated figs? You get the idea. A whole wide variety of questions come in, and it makes this job never get boring, which we really appreciate. Another great thing about taking all these questions and talking to so many people from around the nation in diverse backgrounds, diverse educational backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, means that we get to find out what people are asking, what they're concerned about, and when we talk about those issues, which arguments or which resources or factoids do they find the most compelling. So we take all that information and create a wide range of resources that are available to you and other professionals. In addition to our one-on-one service, we also reach a lot of people with our website, over 5 million page views per year now. And those are eyeballs. That's not hits. That's eyeballs, and we're very proud of that. Hopefully you check out the website at some point. It's got over 700 pages in English and Spanish, lots of specific fact sheets, but also lots of ways to minimize exposure and risk reduction strategies. We're active on social media. We've built several mobile apps. Our most popular one this time of year is an insect repellent locator, which is pretty handy. We stopped doing podcasts. We still have several of them up online, but the interest was waning. You could just watch the page views go down, down, down on podcasts. So instead, we're working on webinars now, a webinar series. We have comics and videos, and we're really trying to expand our video content on YouTube. So like I said, those frequently asked questions that come into the phone lines translate into these products that can hopefully reach even a wider audience. Now, with that, I'd like to move on in the presentation and start looking at some of the problems with glyphosate. Not just one problem, problems. It's one of the most difficult active ingredients to address because it's become wrapped up in several different cultural conversations. The conversation about GMOs, a conversation about cancer, conversations about invasive species, which ones, where do we draw the line, which point in time are we trying to get back to, all those issues. So let's start essentially with the dirt buggy. We've learned that the term glyphosate is hard to say. It's unfamiliar. It sounds like jargon. So when I give presentations about glyphosate, I give it an avatar. And typically I use this dirt buggy because glyphosate as a chemical is dirt loving. If it has a choice between dirt and water, it's always going to choose dirt. And you'll notice that I say the word dirt instead of soil. In school, in graduate school, we all learned to use very technical terms, but we try here at the center to bring it back to what people would say if they haven't been trained in soil science. So since glyphosate is a dirt lover, I'll use this avatar to represent glyphosate at several points in the presentation. Now, it's a dirt lover, which is one of the reasons that many products are registered for application in aquatic areas. If someone made an application near on the edge of this canal, as you can see, it looks like someone has done, you would not expect to find glyphosate way down that canal, because in between, it has had a choice between sticking to the soil particles, sticking to the dirt, sticking to the sediment at the bottom of that channel, and the water. It's always going to choose to glob on to a soil particle. They call that a high absorption coefficient. I like to call it the sticky coefficient. It means it really wants to stick to soil strongly. Now, some people say that it becomes inert after it becomes stuck. I don't like that term because it implies there's absolutely no risk or that it's completely safe after that moment. It's not necessarily true. We've got some data showing that plants can pick up glyphosate from soil particles after it's globbed on. So for example, in spinach, radishes, crops that come in direct contact with the soil, they can pick things up from the soil. So I wouldn't say inert, but it does get stuck strongly. Another thing to be aware of and be able to explain is that glyphosate does not become vaporous after it's been applied and dries onto that surface. Now, if you're making an application and the mist from the application is traveling, that's not the same thing as becoming a vapor. That's actually a liquid particle that's traveling through the air and will settle out in a period of time. And that's why we train pesticide applicators to use low pressure, keep the particles large, because then they fall to the ground faster than they would if they were teeny tiny particles that can get picked up in the wind. Now, some herbicides are able to vaporize or volatilize or evaporate, whatever word works best for your audience, after they've been applied and stuck. So for example, certain ester formulations of 2,4-D and some of the other chlorophenoxyacetic acids can do that. Glyphosate doesn't have that property, so it makes inhalation risk a much lower concern. How does glyphosate work? Well, it disrupts this shikimic acid pathway and inhibits a certain enzyme from being created called EPSP synthase. Now, plants cannot produce all the proteins they need to survive without that enzyme, and it takes them 4 to 20 days to die. And that's because they might already have a nice store of those proteins, so they have to use up those proteins, try to make more, fail, and then things start to fall apart. That's why it takes so long for the plants to die. Now, EPSP synthase is not used by animals, and when I say animals, I'm including humans in that broad category. So you can imagine when someone was developing glyphosate back in the 70s, they said, oh my gosh, we hit the gold mine. Here's a product that doesn't affect animals at all. Its mode of action is irrelevant to humans. This is brilliant. This is wonderful. But it is used by some microorganisms, and in the past few years, that's become a topic of debate about microorganisms in the gut flora. So you'll see articles like this, glyphosate affects microbiota in ruminants. Pulled this article, this is from about 2012, and an answer from, this is kind of a pro-industry blog called the Genetic Literacy Project, calling them out. Is this science or a gut feeling? Just about disrupting the gut microbiome. Now, when we come back to that article, it said affects microbiota. I'm sure if some of you have had physiological training and that sort of thing, microbiology, you know that whatever we eat affects our microbiota. You could say that bananas affect our microbiota. Fruits and vegetables, fast food, all of those things affect. So that headline really doesn't say anything to me as a scientist. Like, yeah, of course it does. Everything does. But for other folks, it might be very alarming to think that the gut microbiota were being affected by this unfamiliar, untrusted substance called glyphosate. So the science is evolving in that area. There's a lot of research being done in this area, and it's fair to say when people ask, the jury's not in on this. The fact that it affects microbiota in the gut is true and possible, but that doesn't necessarily make it a bad effect. So they're doing research right now to look into that. Now, moving on, I want to show you the acute toxicity table. I wouldn't show this to the general public because it's a little intimidating, but essentially, you don't have to read all this, but you get to see that for acute oral exposures, glyphosate falls into the low toxicity category or very low. So when they did tests on rats for acute oral LD50, see how many of them die with each dose, they said 50% of them die with doses between 500 and 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. So that's how they test that. This is a very gross and crude measure of toxicity, but it's true. And they use rats also for inhalation, low or very low, dermal, low, and for eye irritation and skin irritation, they typically use rabbits, but it fell into the low or very low toxicity categories there as well. These studies are completed using the technical grade glyphosate as close to 100% active ingredient as possible. So sometimes it ends up being 97 because it's not that stable, and part of it will break down into something else, but just about as pure as possible. So this comes from the glyphosate technical fact sheet, and I put the link right there, but it's also in a link at the end, and I was a co-author on that fact sheet some years ago. All right, what about accessibility? Can glyphosate get into the body? Well, about a third of glyphosate is absorbed if it gets into the stomach. So that's why I put a green check mark down there on the stomach, that yes, absorption from the stomach can be substantial. Absorption through inhalation, I put an X there because, as we talked about earlier, a vapor is not to be expected with glyphosate. So as long as applicators are using appropriate methods, techniques, and protective equipment, so they're not inhaling the liquid particles floating around, inhalation is not a significant route of exposure. Nor is skin, because only about 2% of glyphosate is absorbed through the skin when it comes in contact with the skin. So it's not a significant route by which people get glyphosate into their bodies. The oral route of exposure is not irrelevant because glyphosate residues might be expected on several crops where glyphosate is allowed to be used. And those would be the Roundup-resistant crops and perhaps others. For example, on the floor of certain orchards, it's allowed to use glyphosate to clean up the orchard floor because it's not expected to get absorbed by those roots. It's going to be stuck to the soil. So there is a tolerance for glyphosate on some fruits and vegetables just in case some of it gets onto the fruit. So the oral route of exposure is not irrelevant. Now, let's talk about cancer. Oh, cancer. Okay, let's look. In particular, draw your attention to these last two bullets. This is the crux of the problem in public communication about cancer. EPA says evidence of non-carcinogenicity, and that was a 1993 risk assessment, and they're currently working on the new risk assessment. They're required to reassess active ingredients every 15 years under FIFRA, PREA, and FEDCA, those laws that apply in this situation, also the SQPA, sorry. The IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, it's part of the World Health Organization, has determined that glyphosate is a probable carcinogen. That's not just a little disagreement. That's two different ends of the spectrum disagreement. And it starts to look sinister from the outside. Why does EPA disagree so much with this organization that has, no ties to industry or whatever it might be? Well, let's dig into this a little bit. I hope you've had a chance to read those first three bullets. I know reading trumps listening, so you probably read those while I was talking. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, let's look at odds ratios. If we're going to dig into this data, we need a little statistics refresher. If there were 4 cancers in the population with exposure and the same number in the population with no exposure, then we'd say that odds ratio equals 1. So if the odds ratio is 1.0, then that means there was no effect of that exposure on the rate of cancer. If instead there were 5 cancers in the population with exposure and only 4 without, then the odds ratio is 1.25. That odds ratio would translate verbally to say there's a 25% higher risk of cancer with exposure compared to a population without exposure. So in this slide, imagine there's a list of chemicals right over here, which there was, and I just took it out. It's irrelevant. But all these different odds ratios represent, this is our best guess in red dot, and the 95% confidence interval is represented by the line. And in the math parts over here that looks really intimidating to many people, this is the 95% confidence interval, this range. Now, if it crosses over the number 1.0, then we can't reject the hypothesis that there was no effect. not with that confidence, right? But if there's a chemical like this that has an odds ratio that's all the way here on the left, we can reject the hypothesis there is no effect. There was an effect, and in this case, this chemical had a protective effect against cancer. There were fewer cancers in the population with exposure. In a chemical like this, we can reject the hypothesis that there was no effect. So there was an effect, and exposure to this chemical resulted in a higher risk of cancer. So if that was about 1.5, then we would say that's a 50% higher risk of cancer with exposure to this chemical. But for all the rest of them, if they're crossing over that number 1, we would say no effect, okay? All right, hopefully everyone's on board, and we're going to dig into this data. Now, this is one slide of many. I'm going to have several in a row. This is the actual human data that was used by IARC to determine the probable characterization. And I've taken these little small numbers and just blown them up into a bigger text box so that we could see them. Now, what I'd like you to do, if you have a piece of paper in front of you and a pen, is to make one heading that says no effect and make another heading that says effect. And we're going to use our hash mark to count them up. Okay? Now, this study was for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I'm only looking at the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma because we're limited on time. And that was the piece that had suggestive evidence according to IARC. So in this study, they found an odds ratio of 0.7 to 1.9. Now, based on what we just learned, effect or no effect? Well, that range includes 1.0, so we can't reject the hypothesis there is no effect. So that's no effect. Put a hash mark under your heading, no effect. Okay, next, 1.1 to 4. Based on what we learned, that means this is effect. There was an effect of that glyphosate exposure, and there was a higher risk, up to 4 times the risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma with exposure to glyphosate. So now you should have one hash mark under each heading. Hopefully you're with me. Next, we have 0.98 to 2.1. Based on what we just learned, no effect. But I'll tell you, that one gives me pause, and I've given a lot of presentations with this content, and it gives other people pause too. I'll ask them, you know, that 0.98 is very close to the number 1. If it was just 0.03 the other direction, then we would be saying effect. Now, where are you on the risk tolerance spectrum? If that was, we're talking about your family and your cancer risk, would you say that that's a hash mark in the effect column or the no effect column? And as individuals listening to the webinar, make the decision for yourself. Would you call that effect or no effect? And put in a hash mark where you see fit. On the next one, this is no effect because clearly it's right in the middle. The number 1.0 is included in that range. How about this one? No effect. How about this one? Effect. Okay. We're keeping track. Next slide. All right. Now this one, holy cow. That one looks different to me. Doesn't it look different to you? That number 54 being so wildly high, that tells me if you have a 95% confidence interval that it's between this number and this number, then you really don't know much at all. You're not confident in much at all because these numbers are so far apart. And it turns out that's because the N, the number of cases in this study was so very low. The variability is really high. So as individuals out there, you can decide if you want to put a hash mark in the no effect column for this study, or if you would throw this study out. As a risk assessor, do you think that is too sloppy of a study with too much variance to use? That's up to you as a risk assessor in this exercise. So put a hash mark or don't. In the next one, this is an effect because the number 1 is not included in that range. How about this one? No effect. All right. Last slide of the, no, it's not the last slide. Let's count these up. 1.1, yeah, that's effect. No effect. No effect. Effect. And effect. So 2 more hash marks under each column. And the question mark I put down at this last one is a result of this high number, 22. That's also a lot of slop in this study. So you decide if you would use that study or not use that study because of the high variance. And the reason I didn't include all of these is I was just focusing on non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in each of these cases. All right. Now, as you add them up, take a look at your hash marks. Depending on how you made those decisions as a personal risk assessor, It might be 7 versus 8. It might be 4 versus 6. But it probably leans toward effect. There were a few more studies that showed an effect than there were studies that showed no effect. So, having looked at that data, the International Agency for Research on Cancer found in this top part that there was limited evidence in human for carcinogenicity of glyphosate. Keep in mind, too, we also have data for a 55,000 person cohort in the Ag Health study that was funded by NIH. It's been a long-term longitudinal study that did not find an association between glyphosate and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or any other major subtype of cancer. So if it was a potent carcinogen, we would have been seeing it in that study as well. So I'm comparing apples to apples with epidemiological studies compared to epidemiological studies in that case. Now, we didn't dig into the data for animals, but they considered it to be sufficient evidence with animal studies. And I hope you're familiar with what those studies look like. It means feeding as much as possible to animals over a long period, usually their whole life. A 2-year period is kind of a surrogate for the whole lifetime of a rat, and then looking to see if there was an increase in cancer incidence in those populations. So adding these things up, they came up with probably. Okay. When I do this talk in front of others, I've done this talk in front of rooms as big as 300 people, and they get in disagreements. No, I think, when it's that close to yes or no, if we're looking at something close to a tie, then that should be unclassifiable. Well, if you're going to be a stickler for statistics, that 0.98 is not the same as 1.0. Then it pushes it the other way. Well, you can imagine this is the same case it is in risk assessment rooms across the world, and they do it differently in different countries. They do it differently in different agencies within the same country. There are some risk assessment agencies that don't look at odds ratios, that don't pay attention to them unless they're over 2.0, like this one is, because there's so much variation in the room underneath there. But others are much more stickler for their statistics. Now, comparing that to some other things, just a few weeks after they made this determination about glyphosate in 2015, they also made a determination about red meat and processed meats using the same risk assessment approach. So glyphosate would be in that same category with pork, beef, and lamb. Q4D was a lower risk, just for comparison, in the possible category. Group 1 contains things like cigarette smoke and arsenic, those things that we're absolutely sure cause cancer, and they found that salami, bacon, and sausages, all those processed meats, including the deli meats that I really like, which is unfortunate, are in that category as well. To put this in context of why the difference, why is there a difference between IARC classifications and a lot of other risk assessments, let's look at the same slide in a different way. If we take out the word cancer and replace it with accidents, according to this IARC statement, you would put cars and banana peels in the same category because they both have been known to cause accidents. That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't say anything about the severity of those accidents, the frequency of those accidents, the likelihood of those accidents. When I ask in big rooms, how many of you have ever fallen on a banana peel, I might get 1. And if I get 0, I say, do you know someone who's ever slipped on a banana peel like they do in the cartoons? I might get 1 person. So the frequency being very low and the severity being very low, you fall and hit your bum, where we know most people have been in a car accident at some point in their lives, as in our American culture, and the severity can be very high. So let's break this down very clearly. IARC only asks this one question: can it cause cancer ever? Just like this slide, can it cause accidents ever? Where the EPA looks at 2 questions: can it cause cancer, and what level of exposure is expected? And putting those things together, is that level of exposure likely to result in cancer? So it's a more robust risk assessment to look at the exposure part, the frequency, the severity, all those other issues in addition to can it cause cancer. In jargon terms, this is called a hazard assessment. Does the hazard exist? And this is called a risk assessment because it looks at hazard and exposure equaling risk. hazard times exposure equals risk. And we'll go into that a little bit more deeply in a risk assessment section. I do need to move quicker, so I'm going to pick up the pace a bit. You should be aware that there was a new issue paper that came out of EPA in September of last year looking at the evaluation of carcinogenic potential. I needed my master's degree to dig through this study and finally found on page 141 of 227 this paragraph where at the very end it says essentially we looked at the data and the strongest support is for not likely to be carcinogenic in humans at doses relevant to human health risk assessment. So this statement's very carefully qualified. I think EPA rightly knew that they'd be very closely scrutinized about this decision because it differs from what people heard in the news about what happened at the World Health Organization and that level. But similarly, the European Food Safety Authority found the same thing. They found it back in 2015, right after IARC had published their decision. So different ways of approaching risk assessment. It doesn't mean that necessarily that anybody is in bed with anybody else or sinister in their way they're looking at the data. It means that they're honest people can look at this data in different ways, and they have. And the risk assessment paradigm that's been adopted by EPA was not chosen by bureaucrats. It was chosen through policy that had representation and public comment and went through all those processes. So if in the United States we are interested in changing the way we do hazard assessment or risk assessment, then that's a valid concern, that's a valid opinion, and it should be taken up with lawmakers and not necessarily with public servants who are executing the policies that exist. So I'll put that out there that if someone really just wants to see the laws change, that we need to do things differently, then direct them to the people who change laws and make clear what you can do and what you cannot do as in your public service role. Why are people so freaked out about glyphosate in general? Because they were freaked out about Roundup and glyphosate before the 2015 hazard assessment. This might be one reason. I brought this up from the USGS study, and this is an estimate of glyphosate use in the United States in 2014. That's the most recent year for which they have data. And this is the state of Iowa. And when you internalize that we live in a time where entire states are treated with the same chemical, that would cause alarm no matter what the chemical was and would cause increased scrutiny. This map is dramatic compared to other active ingredients. In this same website, which I'm a big fan of, and I can send out a link if you like, they break down the use by year and by crop. So this is glyphosate use over time. Look how fast it's gone up. And this is estimated use in millions of pounds of active ingredient, which is a small percentage of some end-use products. A lot of use in corn, a lot of use in soybeans. The red one is cotton, and the rest of them are just smatterings of other uses and use types. So wild invasive species control and those kind of things probably wouldn't even show up on this list because they're very small compared to the millions of pounds used in the major crops. Some dates to be aware of: 1996, 97, this is when Roundup Ready crops were introduced. And another date to be aware of, I think it was about 2010, when the patent expired and use climbed at that point. I'm interested to see this drop off. We see it flatten right out in 2012, 13, 14. Previously, this looked like an exponential rise, and it was just going to keep on going up, but we've had a flattened out use, and that may be because of the rampant glyphosate resistance that is now being detected in almost every state where glyphosate is used. These are very major economic impacts when they happen. It means some applicators I've talked to in the Midwest, for example, have only ever applied glyphosate in their whole career in agriculture, and now they have to figure out another chemical because of this resistance problem and get to know its label and its PPE and all the other different things that go along with it. So the response in agriculture is to have stacked traits. So now we're seeing stacked traits where it's Roundup resistant and dicamba resistant and glufosinate resistant, etc. So that seems to be the approach, that seeds will get more and more resistant to more classes of chemicals. Now with that, we're over halfway through our hour. I've spent a lot of time on glyphosate. Now I want to give you some tools on the science of risk perception and a framework for risk communication. So I'm going to move very quickly. I need to acknowledge Dr. Paul Slovic, who is one of my heroes. He's at the University of Oregon and does a lot of great research. And as I worked at NPIC and answered questions from so many people, I read his articles and think, oh, now it makes sense why people have reacted this way to my arguments or this way to conversations. So I want to pass that along to you. First of all, humans made up the concept of risk. It cannot be objectively measured. For you scientists in the room who are like, you can measure probability, you can measure hazard and exposure, you can, but that's not risk. That's the probability of harm. Risk is a construct in our minds, and the construct is inextricably fused with the idea of benefit. There's no acceptable risk in the absence of benefit. Be aware that there are assumptions involved, subjective judgments. Most of us, including science types like us, determine risk based on fast, intuitive feelings. All right, moving forward, let's talk about benefits. I mentioned it once just in the last sentence. We can't talk about risk without talking about benefits. And it seems very strange if someone calls up asking about the risk of using a certain pesticide and you talk about the benefits of using the pesticide. It might feel weird and feel out of place, but I'm going to make the argument that we have to at least mention what those benefits are. Risks are less likely to be acceptable if the benefits are hidden from view or if they're not fairly distributed among those who bear the risks. Here's a study by Dr. Slovic. They looked at people's perception of the risk of radiation. So they asked them to rank those risks and benefits on a scale of 1 to 5. And it was put in the context that if you lived in an area where a nuclear power plant was located and you could expect a low-level radiation exposure from that, they ranked the risks and benefits. The risks higher than the benefits. But the risk of X-rays, where they beam the radiation directly into your body at high doses, they perceive that benefit to be higher, and therefore the risk is lower. Now, as science types, as risk assessment types, you might say, well, the risk is clearly higher with X-rays because the dose is higher, the exposure is higher. You're right, the risk, the probability of harm is higher with X-rays, but people perceive that risk to be lower because the benefit is higher. They need the information from the X-ray in order to inform their doctor. Similarly, they asked about exposure to chemicals. In the context of pesticides, they said you might be exposed to low levels of pesticides as residue on your foods from lawful use. They perceived that benefit of the pesticide use to be low, and therefore the risk was high. But in exposure to other chemicals, prescription drugs, these are both chemical exposure scenarios. We put prescription drugs directly into our mouths, sometimes more than once a day, and sometimes for years at a time. The measurable probability of harm is higher with prescription drugs. If you've ever looked at the disclosures on a prescription drug, you know very well the risk is higher. But you see what happens, it's very tied to benefit. Prescription drug is beneficial because it's saving my life or it's making my life better. The pesticide doesn't perceive to be benefited if someone is not involved in food production or in wildlife restoration efforts, that they're not involved in that benefit area, then the risk is higher. This is an if benefit, then risk scenario. That's how closely they're tied. I'm going to keep talking about benefit throughout, but I'm going to move on just a bit too into risk perception. In the real world, risk and benefit are positively correlated. And an example would be if you take on high-risk stocks, you can expect to have a higher return on those over a long period than you would from lower risk stocks. The world benefits risk takers. But in our minds, it's actually negatively correlated. And here's a study from Dr. Slovic that shows that. They asked people to rank the benefit and the risk, benefit and the risk of these different items. And all the way from asbestos to GMOs to nanotechnology to solar power, we see this best fit line is a negative correlation. So no wonder it's hard to talk about risk with folks. That being the case, we need to talk about the benefits even more. Now, when we think about benefits, think about your job and the battles that you're fighting with pesticides. Can you articulate the benefits of the applications that you're making? What's at risk? What are we saving by making those applications? What does it make possible? I'm going to charge each of you with trying to explain that to one of your colleagues verbally in the next couple of days. Sit down, explain the benefit of the application to each other until it sounds like, you know, it's natural and it comes out of your mouth like you're not tripping over it, because it's not something we're used to talking about. It feels defensive, but say it more times. Talk about it in different ways so that it's authentic and it comes from you. How do you explain the benefit of this risky thing that we're doing? Now, in addition to benefit, we need to talk about control. Risk denial tends to increase with perceived control. You could also state that differently. Risk perception changes with perceived control. If someone feels like they're in control over a situation, then the risk is immediately lower than a situation where they're not in control. Another way of looking at this, let's look at how risk is defined and who controls that decision. In this study, you could look and see if you're trying to determine, is coal mining getting safer? You could define it either way: accidental deaths per million tons of coal or accidental deaths per 1,000 coal mine employees. Both of those might be valid ways of looking at the risk. But who decides? If someone makes the decision to go with the item on the left, then they might say, yeah, mining's getting safer, we're doing great, no action is needed. Someone who decided to go on the right would say, well, we have a slight upward trend, we have some work to do, and it looks like there are some spikes that we need to explain and address. So whoever makes that decision is in a powerful position to control the conversation. So even though you're using data as risk assessors, and see, look, I have data right here. It was a subjective choice to decide how we measure that risk. And both of these examples count deaths. We could count it differently, because counting fatalities gives equal weight to young and old, painful and painless, voluntary and involuntary. So instead, if we looked at the rate of respiratory illness instead of the rate of death, do you see what I'm getting at here? This is an act of power. So when a government official or an educator stands in front of a room and says, we have measured the risk and it is low and you should listen to me because I know and you don't, it's an act of power. And people always respond questionably to that kind of thing unless they have a lot of trust in the organization that you represent. They're going to say, you know, tell me more about how you came up with those numbers and how you made the decisions. How did you define risk? And did you think about my issue when you were defining risk? It's a fair question. Next, another concept, and I'm going to wrap them all together, I promise. Probability, probability. There's a thing called probability neglect, and it comes about when strong emotions are involved. So people are prone to probability neglect, especially when their emotions are intensely engaged. When probability neglect is at work, people's attention is focused on the bad outcome itself, and they're inattentive to the fact that it is unlikely to occur. Okay, so what are some things that we feel strongly about, visceral about? We feel, I mean, you can get choked up thinking about it. Cancer. Cancer is one of those things. If you've had someone in your life that you lost to cancer, cancer is not a funny thing, and it's not minor, it's terrifying. So when we're talking about cancer risk assessment, strong emotions are involved, right? Which means the probabilities don't mean a thing. So when we come back to people and say, look, the risk is low based on the exposure, yeah, but it's cancer, so I don't care about the probability. This study kind of outlines it. It's kind of complex, so I'm not going to go too much in detail. It essentially shows that people, when they were faced with an electric shock, it really didn't matter if the likelihood was 1% or 99%, they were willing to pay to get out of that risk. Now, if the risk instead was something like $20, which you don't feel very strongly about, then all of a sudden the probability matters. And if it's a 1% risk of a $20 fee, they're going to pay $1. But if it's a 99% risk of a $20 fee, they're going to pay $18. You see what I'm saying? Probability matters when it's a minor thing. Probability does not matter as much when it's a major thing that people are frightened about. This is outlined even further in the fact that toxicologists and the public have a very different way of looking at probability of harm. For toxicologists, that probability matters, if it's low or if it's high. But the general public, if we're talking about cancer, the probability does not matter. So we need to be aware of that and rely less on probability statements when talking about cancer risk. Okay, next study I want to share with you. Worldview affects risk perception. What you see on the slide is a series of statements. And in the study I'm about to describe, people were asked how much they agreed or disagreed with these statements. And using these statements, the researchers basically lumped them into groups: individualists, communitarians, egalitarian, and hierarchists. Different views of the world about what government should and shouldn't do. How important is freedom? How much do we trust experts, essentially? Now, in this study, people with different worldviews were asked about their attitudes toward nanotechnology before and after being given information about nanotechnology. Now, they asked them questions to figure out their worldview. They gave them a paragraph to read about nanotechnology, and it was the same paragraph. Everyone got the same paragraph. They were asked to rank the risk and the benefits of nanotechnology before and after. And here's what happened. When I saw this study, it explained so much to me. Before they read the paragraph, everybody was right about in the middle on a scale of 1 to 5. This is basically right in the middle. But after reading that paragraph, people with certain worldviews said, no, I think the risks are higher than the benefits. We need to step back. And people with another worldview said, hey, look at all the opportunity that is afforded by this new technology. The benefits are higher than the risks. Holy cow. And they were actually opposite going into that. This means that even reading the same information, the same fact sheets that we put out endlessly, the same fact sheets and websites and issue papers that we put out, people can read those and come to different conclusions based on their worldview. And they do all the time. These are other personal outrage factors. I wish I could go in detail about all of them. But essentially, let's look down the left-hand side. Lower risk perceived. Let's think about driving a motorcycle without a helmet. A very dangerous thing that people perceive to be low risk because it's in the person's control. It's voluntary. They might perceive that it's beneficial because it feels good and to have the wind blowing in your hair or whatever else. Might perceive it to be somewhat natural. It only affects adults. It's a familiar risk and a trusted entity. The trusted entity is me. I'm going to drive my motorcycle super careful. I'll just make sure not to fall down, so all's well. These are some of the outrage factors that help us figure out what we think about risk in those fast, intuitive gut feelings. Now, on the other side, we might look at pesticides in drinking water, something that objectively poses a very low risk of harm, but people perceive that risk to be high because it's out of the person's control. It's imposed on them. It's not voluntary. They might not perceive any benefit from that risk. It might be a man-made chemical. It affects their children if it's in their drinking water. It might be unfamiliar or exotic. And it might be an untrusted entity if people don't trust government, or if they don't trust agribusiness, or if they don't trust other entities that are responsible for that exposure. And so, as a risk communicator, my tip to you would be think about these issues and think about how you can use these issues to pull the lever in different directions. So by having open meetings where you take people's views into account, you're giving them some elements of control. By giving them a chance to opt out, by getting on a registry of like a no-spray registry or something, you're making it more voluntary than it was otherwise. By describing the benefits, you can help move that button. If the pesticide you're using is natural, you could talk about that. And there are several pesticides that come from natural origin. You get the idea. And now by behaving in these ways, you're making yourself more of a trusted entity, which helps too. When you get down to all of that, and it's underlined by the fact that each of you probably had different hash marks written down in the exercise earlier, risk perception is personal. Very different individual to individual, and it doesn't mean that when people disagree with the scientists that they're wrong. They perceive it differently for a reason, and we need to be good listeners to figure out why. Okay, we just covered different factors in risk perception, who benefits and how much, who defines the way we measure risk, those gut feelings including probability neglect, worldview, and other outrage factors. Now we're going to go into a framework for risk communication, and I'm aware we're getting close on time, so I'm moving quickly. You can always come back and watch the recording later. I think we are going to have a recording up online. Now, first we need to talk about why I keep saying risk, and people ask about safety. I've answered all those inquiries we talked about earlier. People don't pick up the phone and say, what's the risk? Can you tell me about the risk? They pick up the phone and say, is it safe? Well, I'm going to make the argument that we have to change that language and shift it for these reasons. Safety is a yes or no question. No precautions are necessary if something is safe. If I make the argument to something that the risk is very low or we think it's practically safe, then it can lead toward risky behaviors if they don't think they have to take any precautions. We certainly can't say that safe is safe for everyone because the body of science tells us that certain people are more sensitive to the effect of pesticides than other people. And that includes young people, pregnant people, and we're finding out more over time, elderly people. Also, anyone who has certain medical conditions that make it harder for them to process the pesticides that get into their system. Risk is more accurate because it's not a binomial, it's a scale. Precautions can reduce risk, and we can talk about how risk is higher for certain people, but it is harder to explain. We have to do it though, because the impression of safety can lead to careless behaviors and a lack of vigilance. Why would you have to be careful with something that's safe? And then we have increased risk. I could tell you stories from my time on the phones at the National Pesticide Information Center where this was just laid out in clear terms, but we don't have time. But you may have examples in your own life where something you thought was safe, used it with no inhibitions, and the risk was increased. So how do you reframe that safe question? Someone might ask, is it safe? You could say, the risk is low, but tell me about your specific concerns, and then really listen. We're going to talk about that listening phase in a little bit. Consider tailored approaches. Quickly explain why safe isn't the right word or mindset, because nothing's 100% safe, and certainly pesticides are designed to kill something. So no pesticide is 100% safe. And discuss the risk and things that affect it. This is making you a more trusted entity because you're more accurate about those things, and you're trusting the person to be able to handle the complexity of the situation. Now, when you talk about toxicity and exposure, actually, I should back up and say this is what we call the risk equation. For some of you who might have taken risk assessments and those kind of things, this is a very famous equation. Risk equals toxicity times exposure. You probably remember it from early on in the cancer slides as well. The toxicity or hazard times exposure equals risk. That's how we had it earlier. So you have to talk about toxicity and you have to talk about exposure whenever you're talking about risk. So from my perspective in my world, we might talk about the toxicology of the active ingredient. The signal word is a great tool for talking about toxicity because it's basically a summary of acute toxicity, a dose estimate or certain effects, what's been seen in the literature. To talk about exposure, and I should say, we spend more than half of our time talking about exposure because that's where people can actually make a difference and do something different with their situation. You could talk about the distance, the route of exposure, the physical and chemical properties of the ingredient. Like we chatted about earlier, it makes a difference if you're going to inhale something or if it might be in water based on those physical chemical properties. The duration and frequency of exposure, bioavailability, those are all topics that could come up when talking about toxicity and exposure. So putting all that together, here's the framework that we propose. In order to make informed risk decision making, it stands on toxicity and exposure. We have to have toxicity and exposure. Over time working at NPIC, we've realized that the conversation is not complete without also talking about benefit and control. The benefit of the activity and who has control of the activity. And in particular, when talking to someone about that risk, giving them ideas about things they can do, things that are within their control in that scenario. So building on that and putting together some of the things we learned earlier, here's a proposed checklist for risk communication. And this is a part you might want to come back to. I have it on a Post-it in my office. So I remember when I'm having a conversation about risk to cover those issues. Some of my colleagues have it kind of under the plastic on their blotter on their desk so they can use a pencil to check it off, and then wipe it for the next call. Listen, ask questions, paraphrase. Frame it as risk rather than safety. Say something about the toxicity. Say something about exposure. Mention the benefits of the application. Discuss some action items that are in the person's control. And provide a place where they can get more information. And if you're struggling for an idea about what that might be, I'll refer you to the first 10 slides. Go ahead and give them our phone number, our website. We're located at Oregon State University. It can be a trusted entity to back it up with. And by doing that, by saying where to get more information, you're saying you don't just have to take it from me, that the state of the science is what it is, and you can ask other people. Okay, now some tips from neuroscience that I think are good for risk communicators to be aware of, and then we'll wrap up with some communication moves that build trust. First, be aware that when people experience any kind of social pain, their IQ is decreased up to 20%. It's not a bad thing. It's just the way it is. And it doesn't mean the person is dumb, but if they're disappointed or angry or embarrassed about anything, they're not operating at the top of their game. And that's why we need to work as communicators to say things in different ways, really connect with people where they are, and bring that level of emotional pain down so we can have a better conversation. Here's a study about communicating likelihood. In this study, they asked folks, they described a situation. A patient, Mr. Jones, has been evaluated for discharge from a mental health facility. A psychologist whose professional opinion you respect has evaluated Mr. Jones, and her conclusions stated one way versus another way. One group in the study saw the first statement. Patients similar to Mr. Jones have a 20% probability of committing an act of violence during the first several months after discharge. Another set of people in the study heard it this way. Of every 100 patients similar to Mr. Jones, 20 may commit an act of violence during the first several months after discharge. And then they were asked, based on that statement from the professional, would you discharge them? Stated different ways, it was a twofold difference in do not discharge. 21% of those asked would do not discharge based on that 20% number, but 41% said do not discharge when it was represented as 20 out of 100. Those things, of course, mean the same thing. But let's be aware, this one is more frightening. And I'll say the same thing about cancer risk assessment. We typically say 1 in a million. That's not as reassuring as 0.0000001%. Why is that? Because 20% feels like it's pretty low. You probably won't hurt anyone. But 20 out of 100, you know, he could be one of those 20. And now I'm thinking about 100 mental patients on the loose. I don't like it. So be aware of how you're representing likelihood when you do. A percentage is less frightening than 20 out of 100, whatever you call that. Here's another study to be aware of, finding that sweet spot. When you're making a public health message, for example, you have to pick a place between threat and danger and reward and benefit. Now, they've done some studies to determine what is that sweet spot to maximize learning. Okay, now you've got your paper and your pencil in front of you still, I hope. Write down a number from 0 to 100, where you think that number is. I'll use smoking as an example. If you're going to make an argument about smoking on the threat and danger side, you would talk about how smoking would kill you, you're going to smell bad, girls aren't going to like you, boys aren't going to like you, all the threat and danger stuff. But on the reward and benefit side, you might say, if you quit smoking, you're going to feel better, you're going to live longer, you're going to smell better, all those issues. So where do you think the number is? 0 to 100. Okay. In this study, they found that the magic sweet spot was about 60. If the focus is too much on threat, then learning shuts down. And that's just based on good neuroscience. So when we're making our arguments, we need to remember how important the benefit piece is. We need to spend more time on it, I think. All right, what else can neuroscience tell us? Be aware that the brain wanders about 30% of the time. It's okay to repeat yourself because that happens. People's mind wanders. People tend to internalize the most dominant emotion in the room. That's important to remember in a public meeting kind of setting. For public meetings, there are public meeting organizations that encourage grandstanding, so one individual can take over the emotion of the room, and there are other ways to set up a public meeting, so that is not as likely to happen. Something to read up on. Reading trumps listening, even if you try to do both. People learn best in 20-minute chunks. You'll notice in this exercise, I tried to break it up and have you do something actively every 20 minutes or so, writing something down on your paper or asking yourself a question. It's a nice way to break things up. And to maximize learning, it's helpful to use stories that are tangible and relatable. And it makes that information into a life experience that's a lot easier to recall. And one approach to do that is to say something about feel, felt, found. Acknowledge the person's feelings, share how you felt about something similar. So it might sound like, I can understand why this is so upsetting for you, and I felt the same way before I learned this, this, and this. And then I found that this is actually a bigger risk than that. I feel, felt, found. Can be a handy way of looking at that in a very respectful way. And we just covered a framework for risk communication. We covered several pieces, including some tips from neuroscience. And I just have a little bit more to share with you, and I'll go very quickly. Communication moves that build trust. Always treat your first phone call like this. Treat it like the first conversation of the day. Check your personal opinions at the door. They didn't call to ask for your personal opinion. Even if you're an expert, you're representing an agency, you're representing your organization, and it's important to remember that. And then you don't feel personally attacked as well when they attack the position of the organization. Give the person your full attention. This is kind of creeping into society where it's very common for people to be reading something while they're listening or entering data while they're listening. It's not respectful, and it doesn't make people feel good. Set the tone for the conversation. Ask questions, listen, build a picture of the situation. If the person's describing to you any exposures that might be ongoing, help them get them to stop. So if they have something on their skin, go wash up, and I'll wait for you to come back. Or if they're standing in a place where they're smelling something, is there a place that you can go and we can finish the conversation where you're not smelling that material? Clearly describe what you can and cannot do. Start listing the person's questions as they tell their story. Choose words that reflect the uncertainty, things like may, might have, could have, and admit when you don't know the answer, and admit when science doesn't know the answer, that we just haven't found, we're not confident about that yet. There's a hole here. It's fair to say that, because certainly that is the case for many things. Active listening, I think to just sum it up, the listening phase is over when you can paraphrase the story or question back to the person and get their agreement. You might recognize that from different settings, or working with special needs kids or marriage counseling. This is just a good idea in general, to listen until you can paraphrase that question or story back to the person and get their agreement. Some examples are provided in the bullets. Empathy, you can be empathetic without necessarily agreeing with the person. So they might be alleging that they have several health problems as a result of herbicide exposure. You don't have to agree with them in order to show empathy and kind of be a human in that conversation, an empathetic human. That helps. Also, use words that, don't use words that are unnecessarily long or complex. Especially utilize. That one really jumps out at me. There's no reason to use that word ever. It means the same thing as use, and it just is unnecessarily long and off-putting. So after you write a piece, whether it's for social media or for your website, go back and look at it again and see if you can replace any words that are unnecessarily long or complex. And once you're good at working on all of those things, then you'll have to work on the art of bringing it down. This is an image from the Debunking Handbook, and I provided a link in the last slide. It's a very handy handbook about debunking myths, and it means if we provide too much in response to a myth, then the only thing they walk away remembering is the myth. But if you can break down your myth-busting material into a very shorter pieces, it's much more likely to be retained. And of course, Jack Kerouac said it best. One day I will find the right words, and they will be simple. Aren't we all trying to get to that point? So in today's webinar, we covered these topics just as a quick recap. In the final slides, I wanted to remind you of this checklist, that it's one of the best take-homes, I hope, from this presentation. Remember to practice talking about benefits. It's important. It's fused in the mind with the idea of risk. And here are some neat resources that you might check out at a later date. We have some glyphosate resources, the debunking handbook, and one of my favorite books on this topic is listed there at the bottom as well. It's available from Amazon. So with that, I will stop. I know I'm a little late, but not too bad. I'm ready to start taking questions.
You did a great job, Kaci. Thank you so much. So this is the time for questions. We have a couple in the queue, but go ahead and type your questions in the question box, and we will share them with Kaci. So I will start with the first one that came up during the medical studies, the review of the medical studies. So these studies highlight the problem being that there's a low N number of individuals in the study. Shouldn't we pay more attention to the larger studies cited in that case?
Well, certainly it has more power statistically. The larger study does. The series of small epidemiological studies actually led to the Ag Health study. Epidemiologists were really tired of hearing, well, your N is too low. So they put together the biggest study in history, and it certainly has more statistical power. It's true. You're right.
The next question is from Kate Jensen, and she asks, I've always wondered, how did risk equal toxicity times exposure come about? Why not toxicity plus exposure or some other function?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, it comes back to the basis of toxicology. Paracelsus, I think, was the father of toxicology, said the dose makes the poison. Anything could be a poison. It is the dose that makes it a poison. So the toxicity is basically its potency. We often express it in milligrams per kilogram as a dose. It might be low, moderate, high, category 1, 2, and 3, but it's the potency, and exposure says how much of that dose is being delivered. So why is it a multiplication factor? I think that's, it could be a plus. You could look at it that way as well. When you look at how EPA does the risk assessments, they do the one part hazard assessment first, then they do the exposure assessment, and they don't necessarily multiply those things, but they apply one to the other. At this potency, at this exposure, what is the risk?
Okay, thank you, Kaci. We have another question from Shelley Buranek. You referenced several great peer-reviewed studies, and you definitely did, particularly about risk assessment and perceptions. Would you be able to provide a list of those or other recommended references? And I can say, Kaci, I intend to send a follow-up email to everyone who signed up with the links that you've provided. So I should include reference.
Sure, and I could probably make it a little quicker for you. Several of the references were included on the slides, not all of them. I noticed that last night, of course, and like, oh, I better go put those citations in, but I can assemble something better. But even, I think even better than that, if you're really interested to dig into these, Paul Slovic has written a book, The Perception of Risk, and where he kind of brings together all of these studies that he's been involved with, and it was a really influential book in my understanding of that. So that's kind of a place where you could read all of those studies and more, but I'll try to get the rest of those citations to Terry soon.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? That's the last one that I see. I can say personally this has been really, really useful for me, and I think that's probably true for many of the people on the phone. Just understanding better about how people process information and make decisions can be really helpful in determining how to approach the communication of risk.
Good, good. It's intimidating to try to tell such astute professionals anything they didn't already know. So tried to focus on those pieces that are, you know, from psychology and risk perception. We don't get that kind of training in our disciplines very much.
There is one more question. I have a PhD in natural resources and environmental sciences. I have a hard time with people that base their opposition to pesticides and GMOs based on emotion. Any tips on communicating with people who don't have a science background?
Yes, and the first thing is to ask questions and listen. I have been surprised sometimes when I ask, what is the basis of your opposition to GMOs in particular? Well, I don't like Monsanto. I think they have bad business practices. They're bad actors. Okay, well, that has nothing to do with toxicity or the ecological implications. That's totally different. So by asking that question and listening, we figure out what it's really about. So if it is about potential ecological impacts, then with your astute background, you can hopefully address those issues that here's the studies we've done in that area, here are the studies we need to do in that area, and then again, ask questions and listen. What else should we be thinking of that as a discipline we haven't looked at yet? What can you contribute, worried person? You know what I mean? It shows respect. It makes you a trusted entity, more of a trusted entity, and saves a lot of wasted time addressing issues that may not be the issue.
Yes. Duly noted. And we have one comment. Nice job. Very informative. Good pace of presentation. I know you felt rushed, Kaci, and good subject coverage. So
oh, wonderful. I'm glad to hear it. And I'm honored that so many of you took time to come today and to hear what we had to say. And I hope that I was able to convince you that NPIC is a great resource and that it would be beneficial to rely on us more in the work that you do and put our phone number out there and our website out there as a reliable resource.
Right, and we just got an excellent presentation, so I'll share all the comments with you, Kaci, afterwards. And if we have no more questions, I again want to thank you all for participating, and thank you, Kaci, for taking time to do the presentation. And I will make sure that the attendees have all of these links, and we will be following up with you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you all again. Bye.
Bye.